There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than screams, when the absence of love hurts more than any physical pain. I'm Vanessa, and at 68 years old, I thought I knew what heartbreak was. I had buried my husband 2 years ago, mourned the love of my life, and somehow found the strength to keep going. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the day my own son would look at me like I was a stranger invading his space. It started with small things. The way Lucas would walk past me without acknowledgement, as if I had become furniture in my own home. The house that Richard and I had built together, where we raised our children, where every corner held memories of laughter and tears, birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings. This house was my sanctuary, my refuge, the place where I belonged more than anywhere else in the world. But after Richard's funeral, something shifted in Lucas's eyes. The grief we both carried seemed to transform him into someone I didn't recognize. Where once there had been warmth and respect, now there was only cold indifference. He moved through our shared space like I was invisible, like my presence was an inconvenience he had to tolerate. That Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in Richard's favorite armchair, the old brown recliner that still held the impression of his body, still carried the faint scent of his cologne, mixed with the leather he loved to polish every weekend. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was simply existing in the space where my husband used to read his evening newspaper, where he would call me over to share funny stories or discuss our plans for tomorrow. I closed my eyes and let myself remember. Richard's gentle hands adjusting the reading lamp, his soft chuckle at the comics section, the way he would reach for my hand when I passed by his chair. These moments were all I had left of him, and sitting in that chair made me feel close to him again, made the loneliness a little more bearable. The sound of footsteps interrupted my reverie. Lucas entered the living room, and I opened my eyes, expecting perhaps a greeting, maybe even a shared memory about his father. Instead, I saw something that made my blood freeze. His face was twisted with an expression I had never seen before, not just anger, but genuine disgust. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and venomous. The words hit me like physical blows. My own son, the baby I had carried for 9 months, the child I had nursed through countless fevers and nightmares, the young man I had supported through college and career struggles, was telling me I didn't belong in my own home. Before I could process what was happening, his hand was on my arm, not gently, not with the loving touch I remembered from when he was small and needed comfort. His fingers dug into my flesh with deliberate cruelty as he yanked me up from the chair. The pain shot through my shoulder, but it was nothing compared to the agony in my chest as I realized my son, my baby, was physically hurting me. I gasped, not from the pain in my arm, but from the complete shattering of everything I thought I knew about my relationship with my child. This was Lucas, who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them beautiful flowers for the most beautiful mama. This was the boy who had cried when I got a small cut while cooking, who had promised to always protect me when Daddy wasn't home. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I was just what?" he snapped, his grip tightening. "Just making yourself comfortable in my house? Just pretending like you own the place?" His words were calculated to wound, each one carefully chosen to strip away another piece of my dignity, my sense of belonging, my identity as his mother. The shame washed over me like a wave. Here I was, a grown woman, a mother, a widow trying to grieve her husband in peace, being manhandled by her own child. The embarrassment was overwhelming. What if the neighbors could see? What if Richard's spirit was watching? What would he think of his son treating his mother this way? I found myself actually apologizing, for sitting in my own living room, in my deceased husband's chair. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. I didn't know. I thought, if you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And please comment which city you're watching from. Lucas released my arm with a push that sent me stumbling slightly. The physical pain was temporary, but the emotional devastation lingered like poison in my veins. I retreated to my bedroom, the same bedroom I had shared with Richard for 35 years, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My arm ached where his fingers had gripped me, and I could already see the red marks that would surely become bruises by tomorrow. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of being treated like an unwelcome intruder in the home where I had spent the best years of my life. I told myself it was grief. Lucas was mourning his father, just as I was. People say and do things they don't mean when they're processing loss. Surely this was just a moment of misplaced anger, a temporary lapse in judgment that we could work through together. Surely my son, the boy I had raised to be kind and respectful, would come to his senses and apologize. But as I sat there in the growing darkness, massaging the tender spots on my arm, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed between us. The way he had looked at me, not with momentary anger, but with sustained contempt, suggested this wasn't just about grief. This was about power, about control, about redefining our relationship in terms I didn't understand and hadn't agreed to. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that look on Lucas's face, could feel his fingers digging into my arm, could hear his voice telling me I didn't belong in the only home I had ever truly known. The bed felt enormous and empty without Richard beside me, but now it also felt unsafe, like even my most private space could be invaded and violated without warning. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, and whether the son I thought I knew had ever really existed at all. The bruises on my arm faded within a week, but the invisible wounds kept growing deeper. What I had hoped was an isolated incident, a moment of grief-fueled anger, revealed itself to be just the beginning of my son's systematic campaign to erase me from my own life. Lucas's wife, Miranda, had always been polite but distant. During the years of my marriage to Richard, she maintained the bare minimum of civility required for family gatherings. She would smile tightly during holiday dinners, contribute little to conversations, and always seemed eager to leave. I had attributed her coldness to shyness, perhaps even a bit of intimidation at joining an established family. How naive I was. After Richard's death, Miranda's true nature emerged like a snake shedding its skin. The polite mask disappeared entirely, replaced by open hostility that made every interaction feel like walking through a minefield. She no longer bothered with pleasantries or even basic courtesy. When I would say good morning, she would look right through me as if I hadn't spoken. When I offered to help with dinner preparations, she would respond with exaggerated sighs and eye rolls that made it clear my presence was not just unwanted, it was offensive to her. "We need to talk about your mother," I overheard her telling Lucas one evening as I passed by their bedroom door. Her voice carried the authoritative tone of someone making a business decision rather than discussing a family member. "This situation isn't working anymore. She's becoming a problem." A problem. That's what I had become in my own home. Not a grieving widow deserving compassion. Not a mother who had devoted her life to her family. Not even a human being worthy of basic respect. I was simply a problem to be solved. An obstacle to be removed. The changes started small but accelerated quickly. Suddenly, meals were prepared without consideration for my dietary needs or preferences. Miranda would cook elaborate dinners featuring ingredients she knew I couldn't eat due to my diabetes, then act surprised when I couldn't join them at the table. "Oh, I forgot about your restrictions," she would say with mock concern, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I guess you'll have to figure something else out." Lucas watched these interactions with growing approval, as if Miranda was successfully implementing a strategy they had discussed in private. He began echoing her dismissive attitude, treating my basic needs as unreasonable demands rather than normal human requirements. When I asked if we could keep some of my diabetic-friendly foods in the refrigerator, he responded with exasperation. "Mom, you can't expect us to reorganize our entire kitchen around your medical issues," he said, using the same tone he might use with a difficult customer at work. "You're a grown woman. Figure out how to manage your own diet." The financial control came next. Richard had always handled our money, and after his death, Lucas had naturally stepped in to help me navigate the complex paperwork of insurance claims, bank accounts, and investment portfolios. I had been grateful for his assistance, touched by what I perceived as filial devotion during my time of need. How could I have known he was actually positioning himself to take control of resources that belonged to me? For your own protection, Lucas explained when he suggested we consolidate our accounts to make things simpler. You're not used to handling these amounts of money, Mom. It's easy to make costly mistakes when you're grieving and not thinking clearly. His logic seemed reasonable at the time. I was overwhelmed by financial details I had never needed to understand while Richard was alive. Having Lucas manage these complex matters felt like a blessing, a way for my son to honor his father's memory by taking care of me the way Richard would have wanted. But taking care of me quickly transformed into taking control of me. My credit cards were temporarily held by Lucas for security purposes. My checkbook was safeguarded in his office to prevent fraudulent activity. My Social Security and pension payments were redirected for efficiency into accounts I no longer had access to. When I needed money for basic necessities, groceries, medications, personal care items, I had to ask Lucas for permission like a child requesting an allowance. He would question every purchase, examine every receipt, and make me justify expenses that had been routine parts of my life for decades. $40 for shampoo and conditioner? He would ask, holding the receipt like evidence of financial irresponsibility. Mom, you can get perfectly good products at the dollar store for a fraction of that cost. We need to be more careful about unnecessary spending. The woman who had managed a household budget for 35 years, who had stretched every dollar to provide for her family, who had saved money through decades of careful planning, was now being lectured about fiscal responsibility by her own son. The humiliation was suffocating. Miranda delighted in these moments of my degradation. She would stand behind Lucas during these interrogations, her arms crossed and her expression smug, as if watching a misbehaving child receive well-deserved discipline. Sometimes she would add her own commentary, always phrased as helpful suggestions, but delivered with unmistakable cruelty. Maybe Vanessa would benefit from a basic budgeting class, she would say, using my first name instead of any familial title, emphasizing my diminished status in the household hierarchy. They offer financial literacy programs for seniors at the community center. It might help her understand why these expenses are problematic. The social isolation was perhaps the cruelest element of their campaign. My friends from church, neighbors I had known for decades, family members who had been part of my life since before Lucas was born, all of these relationships were systematically severed through a combination of direct interference and manufactured obstacles. When my sister called to check on me, Lucas would answer the phone and explain that I was resting or not feeling well enough for visitors. When friends invited me to lunch or social gatherings, Miranda would inform them that I was no longer able to participate in outside activities due to my declining health. The few times I managed to answer the phone myself, Lucas would hover nearby, listening to every word and making facial expressions that clearly communicated his displeasure with my conversations. The anxiety of being monitored made it impossible to speak freely or honestly about my situation. How could I tell my sister that I was being mistreated when my son was standing 3 feet away, watching my every expression? Church had been my sanctuary for 40 years, the place where I found comfort, community, and spiritual strength during both joyful and difficult times. After Richard's death, Sunday services became even more important to me as a source of healing and hope. But suddenly, transportation to church became complicated. The car needs work, Lucas would announce on Sunday mornings. It's not safe to drive right now. I have some urgent work to finish, he would say other weeks. I can't spare the time to drive you today. You seemed confused this morning, Miranda would add with false concern. Maybe it's better if you stay home and rest. We wouldn't want you to have an episode in public. Episode. As if grief and sadness were symptoms of mental instability, rather than normal responses to losing the love of my life. As if my emotional pain was evidence of cognitive decline, rather than proof of the depth of my love for Richard. The few times I insisted on attending church, calling a taxi or asking a neighbor for a ride, I would return home to find locks changed, belongings moved, or rules established that hadn't existed when I left. It became clear that my absence was being used as an opportunity to further diminish my presence in the house. We thought you had decided to move out, Miranda would say with theatrical surprise when I returned from church. You've been talking about finding your own place, and when you left this morning, we assumed. I had never talked about moving out. The suggestion was entirely fabricated, but delivered with such conviction that I began to doubt my own memory. Was I becoming confused? Had I said things I didn't remember saying? The gaslighting was so subtle and persistent that I started questioning my own sanity. At night, lying in the bed I had shared with Richard, I would replay conversations and interactions, trying to determine what was real and what was manipulation. The uncertainty was almost worse than the outright cruelty, because it made me doubt everything I thought I knew about my own mind, my own memories, my own worth as a human being. The woman who had once been the heart of this household, who had made every major decision alongside her husband, who had been respected and valued by her family and community, was disappearing piece by piece. Each day brought new humiliations, new restrictions, new evidence that the people I had loved and sacrificed for saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient burden to be managed until they could find a way to dispose of me entirely. But even in my darkest moments, even when I felt completely powerless and utterly alone, something deep inside me refused to accept this fate. Perhaps it was Richard's voice echoing in my memory, reminding me of my strength. Perhaps it was the example of my own mother, who had faced hardships with dignity and determination. Or perhaps it was simply the stubborn spark of self-preservation that refuses to be extinguished even under the most brutal circumstances. Whatever it was, it kept me alert, kept me observing, kept me remembering. Because somewhere in the deepest part of my soul, I knew this story wasn't over. There's a special kind of torture in being erased while you're still alive, in watching your own existence become smaller and smaller until you wonder if you ever mattered at all. By the 3rd month after Richard's death, I had become a ghost haunting my own home, a shadow moving through spaces where I once belonged. The morning routine became my daily humiliation. I would wake up early, as I had done for decades, and quietly make my way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. It was automatic, this urge to nurture and care for my family, even though that family had made it clear they no longer wanted my care. Old habits die hard, especially when they're rooted in love that refuses to acknowledge its own rejection. I would set the table for 3, arrange fresh flowers in the center, roses from the garden Richard and I had planted together, and prepare the kind of hearty breakfast that had once brought joy to our household. Scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, fresh biscuits with homemade jam, orange juice squeezed from the tree in our backyard. The aromas would fill the kitchen, creating the illusion of warmth and family that had once been our reality. But when Lucas and Miranda came downstairs, they would look at the spread I had prepared with expressions ranging from annoyance to outright disgust. Miranda would wrinkle her nose as if the smell of bacon was offensive to her delicate sensibilities. "We don't eat breakfast anymore, Vanessa," she would announce, using my first name like a weapon designed to establish distance and hierarchy. "We're doing intermittent fasting now. All this food is just wasteful." Lucas would nod in agreement, grabbing a protein shake from the refrigerator instead. "Mom, you need to stop assuming we want these heavy meals. We're trying to maintain healthy lifestyles here." Healthy lifestyles. As if the breakfast traditions that had nourished our family for decades were somehow toxic. As if the love I poured into every meal was contaminating their perfect new existence. I would stand there, spatula still in hand, watching them dismiss hours of work with casual cruelty that left me feeling smaller than the crumbs they swept off the counter. "I'm sorry," I would whisper, already reaching to clear away the food. "I didn't know. I was just trying to..." "Trying to what?" Miranda would interrupt, her voice sharp with impatience. "Control what we eat? Force your old-fashioned ideas on us? We're adults, Vanessa. We can make our own food choices." The leftover food would go into containers that sat in the refrigerator until they spoiled. Constant reminders of my failed attempts to matter in my own kitchen. I began to measure my worth by the fullness of those containers, by how long my unwanted offerings would sit untouched before being thrown away like the garbage they apparently represented to the people I was trying to love. The holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving had always been my masterpiece, the day when I transformed our dining room into a showcase of gratitude and abundance. I would spend weeks planning the menu, shopping for ingredients, preparing dishes that carried the flavors of family traditions passed down through generations. The turkey with my grandmother's secret seasoning, the stuffing my mother had taught me to make, the cranberry sauce that Richard said was better than anything store-bought. But that first Thanksgiving without Richard, as I began my usual preparations, Miranda made an announcement that shattered what remained of my connection to our family traditions. "Lucas and I have decided to spend Thanksgiving with my parents this year," she said, not bothering to look up from her magazine as she delivered this devastating news. "It's time to start new traditions, don't you think? Move forward instead of dwelling in the past. New traditions." As if 4 decades of family history was just dwelling in the past. As if the love and labor I had invested in creating meaningful celebrations was somehow holding them back from happiness. I felt the words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully aimed at the parts of my identity that had already been wounded beyond repair. "What about," I started to say, then stopped myself. What about me? What about the fact that this was my home, my holiday, my kitchen where these traditions had been born and nurtured? What about the empty chair where Richard should have been sitting, the grief that I was supposed to be processing surrounded by family who loved and supported me? But I already knew the answer. They simply didn't care about my needs, my feelings, or my right to spend holidays in my own home with my own family. I had become an inconvenience to be worked around rather than a person to be included. "Nothing, dear," I said quietly, turning back to the sink where I had been washing vegetables for a dinner that would never happen. "That sounds lovely for you both." They left that morning, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying expensive wine and flowers for Miranda's parents. I watched from the living room window as they loaded gifts into their car, presents I hadn't been asked to contribute to, celebrations I hadn't been invited to share. They drove away without looking back, leaving me alone with a turkey that was already thawing and side dishes I had foolishly begun preparing for a family that no longer considered me family. I spent Thanksgiving Day sitting in Richard's chair, eating a peanut butter sandwich, and looking at old photo albums filled with pictures of holidays when Lucas was small, when he would help me set the table and taste everything before it was finished cooking. The little boy who used to say my stuffing was better than any restaurant's was now a man who couldn't even spare me a phone call on the holiday I had made special for him his entire life. The comparison games became another form of psychological torture. Miranda had a way of highlighting every area where I fell short of her standards, every way in which my age, my background, and my circumstances made me inferior to the kind of mother-in-law she deserved. "My mother always looks so put together," she would say, while examining my appearance with critical eyes. "Even in her 70s, she gets her hair done every week and maintains such elegant style. It's inspiring, really, how some women refuse to let age diminish their pride in their appearance. I would instinctively touch my gray hair, styled simply because I could no longer afford weekly salon visits, and feel the shame creep up my neck like a fever. My clothes, purchased from discount stores rather than department stores, suddenly felt shabby and inappropriate. My makeup, applied carefully but without the benefit of expensive products or professional techniques, seemed garish and aging under her scrutiny. "My mother still hosts the most wonderful dinner parties," Miranda would continue, her voice filled with admiration for this paragon of maternal perfection. "She has such a gift for entertaining, such natural elegance. Her home is like something from a magazine, always perfectly decorated, always ready for guests." I would look around the living room that Richard and I had furnished over decades of careful saving, each piece chosen for comfort and durability, rather than style or status. The coffee table with the ring stains from years of family gatherings, the sofa that was beginning to sag but still provided the perfect spot for reading and watching television, the family photos in mismatched frames that told the story of our life together. All of it suddenly seemed pathetic and embarrassing when measured against the standards of Miranda's apparently perfect mother. Lucas began echoing these comparisons, as if his wife's critical observations had opened his eyes to deficiencies he had never noticed before. "Mrs. Peterson's house always smells amazing," he would say after visiting Miranda's parents. "She uses these expensive candles and has fresh flowers everywhere. It makes such a difference in the atmosphere." Our house smelled like the vanilla and cinnamon I used in my baking, like the lavender sachets I tucked into closets and drawers, like the natural sense of a home where people actually lived and cooked and existed as human beings rather than magazine models. But suddenly these familiar, comforting aromas were inadequate compared to the artificial perfection of professionally maintained spaces. The cruelest moments came when they would discuss their future plans in front of me, talking about the life they intended to build as if I had no role in it whatsoever. They would sit at the dining room table with real estate brochures and architectural magazines, planning renovations and improvements to the house that had been my home for decades. "When we redo the master bedroom," Miranda would say, spreading paint samples across the table where Richard and I had shared thousands of meals, "I want to go with a completely modern aesthetic. Clean lines, minimal decoration, sophisticated color palette. When we redo." As if the bedroom where I had slept beside my husband for 35 years was already theirs to transform. As if my presence was so temporary and insignificant that it didn't need to be considered in their planning process. "The kitchen definitely needs to be gutted," Lucas would add, gesturing around the space where I had prepared meals for our family for decades. "These cabinets are so dated and the layout is completely inefficient. We'll need to start from scratch to make it functional for modern cooking." Modern cooking. As if the meals I had prepared with love and skill in this kitchen were somehow primitive or inadequate. As if the space that had been the heart of our home needed to be destroyed in order to meet their superior standards. They would spend hours discussing these plans, their voices animated with excitement about the future they were creating for themselves. I would sit in the corner, ostensibly watching television but actually listening to every word, feeling my existence being erased from the narrative of the house I still legally owned. The worst part was how they would occasionally include me in these conversations, but only to point out problems or limitations that my presence created. "Of course, we'll have to wait until we have more space," Miranda would say with exaggerated patience. "Right now, we're working around certain constraints that limit our options." Constraints. That's what I had become. Not a person with feelings and rights, but a constraint to be managed until it could be eliminated entirely. But even as I felt myself disappearing, even as every day brought new evidence that I had become unwanted in my own life, something inside me was taking notes. Some part of my mind that remained clear and sharp was cataloging every cruelty, every manipulation, every moment when the people I had loved and sacrificed for revealed exactly who they really were. I may have become invisible to them, but I was learning to see them with perfect clarity. And what I saw was going to change everything. There comes a moment in every person's life when the weight of accumulated pain becomes so heavy that even hope seems like a luxury they can no longer afford. For me, that moment arrived on a cold February morning, 6 months after Richard's death, when I discovered that even my most cherished memories were no longer safe from their cruelty. I had been quietly organizing Richard's belongings, a task I had been avoiding because it felt too final, too much like admitting he was never coming home. But the house felt smaller every day with the tension between Lucas, Miranda, and myself, and I thought perhaps clearing out some of Richard's things might create space, literally and emotionally, for us to find our way back to being a family. I started with his dresser, carefully folding the shirts that still smelled faintly of his cologne, setting aside the ties he had worn to church every Sunday for 30 years. Each item carried memories. The blue sweater I had given him for Christmas 5 years ago, the pajamas he had worn during his last hospital stay, the watch his father had passed down to him, and that he had always planned to give to Lucas someday. At the bottom of his sock drawer, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, I found the small wooden box where Richard kept his most precious mementos. Inside were the love letters we had written to each other during our brief courtship, ticket stubs from our first movie date, the dried corsage from our wedding day, and dozens of photographs documenting our life together. I sat on the bedroom floor, surrounded by these treasures, and for the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to really cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears I had shed in public, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of a woman who had lost her soulmate and was still discovering the depth of that loss every single day. I was holding a photograph of Richard and baby Lucas, my husband grinning proudly while our son, maybe 6 months old, reached up to grab his father's nose, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly wiped my eyes and tried to compose myself, but Lucas appeared in the doorway before I could hide the evidence of my emotional breakdown. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice already carrying that edge of irritation that had become his default tone when addressing me. His eyes surveyed the scattered belongings with obvious displeasure. "I was just organizing some of your father's things," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought maybe you'd like to have some of them. His watch, maybe? Or some of the photos? You should have asked permission before going through his stuff," Lucas interrupted, stepping into the room with the authority of someone claiming territory. "These aren't just your memories. Dad was my father too. His father too." As if my 35 years of marriage somehow gave me equal claim to Richard's memory, rather than the primary right to grieve him as I saw fit. As if the woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, his daily life for over 3 decades was just another interested party in the distribution of his legacy. Miranda appeared behind him, drawn by the sound of our conversation like a vulture sensing opportunity. She surveyed the scene with obvious satisfaction, as if she had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment to further diminish my status in the household. "Oh my," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "This is quite a mess, isn't it? Vanessa, you really should have cleared this with us before starting such a major project. We've been talking about organizing Richard's belongings properly, systematically, not just emotional scavenging." Emotional scavenging. The phrase hit me like a slap. The woman who had never spoken more than 10 words to my husband during his lifetime was now characterizing my grief as scavenging, my attempt to preserve his memory as some kind of selfish treasure hunt. "I wasn't scavenging," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was remembering. I was trying to honor him." Lucas knelt down and began gathering the photographs with sharp, possessive movements. "These need to be properly sorted and preserved, not scattered around on the floor while you have some kind of breakdown." He picked up the photo of himself as a baby, the one that had been making me cry with its evidence of pure love and joy between father and son. For a moment, I thought I saw his expression soften as he looked at his younger self in his father's arms. But when he looked back at me, his face had hardened again. "You can't just wallow in the past forever, Mom," he said, using the same tone he might use to scold a child caught misbehaving. "Dad is gone. This kind of melodrama isn't helping anyone." Melodrama. My grief for the love of my life, my need to process his absence and preserve his memory, my human response to losing the person who had been my anchor for 4 decades. All of it dismissed as melodrama, as if genuine emotion was somehow inappropriate or excessive. Miranda began collecting the love letters, handling them with the clinical efficiency of someone disposing of unimportant documents. "These personal papers should really be stored properly," she said, not bothering to look at the words that had once carried the hopes and dreams of 2 young people falling in love. "In acid-free boxes, away from light and moisture. They're deteriorating just sitting out like this. Away from light, away from warmth, away from the hands and eyes of the woman who had written and received them, who could still remember the exact circumstances that had prompted each declaration of love. They wanted to preserve Richard's memory, but only in forms that excluded me from accessing it, only in ways that turned our shared history into museum pieces rather than living connections to the life we had built together." I sat there on the floor, watching them systematically remove every trace of Richard from my reach, and felt something break inside me that was different from heartbreak, different from grief. This was the moment when I stopped believing that love could survive anything, when I finally understood that the people I had devoted my life to were not just indifferent to my pain, they were actively feeding on it. "Maybe you should take a little break," Miranda suggested, her voice carrying the patronizing tone medical professionals use with elderly patients they assume are losing their mental faculties. "Go lie down for a while. Let us handle this properly. Let us handle this." Richard's life, our marriage, his death, his memory, all of it had become something for them to handle rather than something for me to experience, process, or treasure. I had been demoted from widow to bystander, from wife to inconvenient witness to a life they now claimed ownership over. I stood up slowly, my knees aching from sitting on the hard floor, and walked toward the bedroom door. Behind me, I could hear them continuing to sort through Richard's belongings with businesslike efficiency, discussing which items had real value and which ones could be disposed of without sentiment or ceremony. That night, I lay in the bed that felt enormous and empty without Richard beside me, staring at his nightstand where his reading glasses used to sit, where his water glass left rings on the wood, where his Bible lay open to whatever passage had brought him comfort on his last night alive. All of it was gone now, cleared away for proper storage in places I would need permission to access. The next morning, I found them in the living room with a professional appraiser, a thin man in an expensive suit who was examining Richard's stamp collection, a hobby he had maintained since childhood, adding new specimens from around the world, cataloging and organizing them with the patience and precision that characterized everything he did. "This is actually quite valuable," the appraiser was saying, running his fingers over albums that represented 40 years of careful collecting. "Properly sold, this collection could bring $15,000 to $20,000. $15,000 to $20,000. I watched Lucas's eyes light up with an interest he had never shown in his father's hobby while Richard was alive. During all those evenings when Richard had tried to share his passion for stamps with his son, explaining the history behind rare specimens or the stories of the countries they came from, Lucas had been politely bored, checking his watch and making excuses to leave the room. Now, suddenly, this dismissed hobby had become valuable enough to capture his complete attention. "We'll need to have everything professionally cataloged," Miranda was saying, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. "Get proper appraisals for insurance purposes." Insurance purposes. They were already planning to sell Richard's collection, to convert his passion into cash without any consideration for its sentimental value or its connection to the man who had spent decades building it with love and care. "What about Mom?" I heard Lucas ask quietly, as if I weren't standing right there. "Does she have any legal claim to this stuff?" "Everything was jointly owned," the appraiser replied in the neutral tone of someone who discussed these matters regularly. "But if she's living in your house now, dependent on your support, the practical considerations might outweigh the legal ones." Your house. As if the home Richard and I had purchased together, where we had raised our family and built our life, had somehow transferred ownership the moment he died. As if my grief and vulnerability had automatically voided my rights to the property and possessions we had accumulated together. I stood in the doorway, watching them discuss my husband's legacy as if I were invisible, and felt the last remnants of hope finally drain out of me like water from a broken cup. These people didn't see me as family anymore. They didn't see me as Richard's widow, as Lucas's mother, as a human being deserving of basic dignity and consideration. They saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance, a problem to be managed until they could figure out how to eliminate me entirely. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it brought an odd kind of clarity. For months, I had been trying to understand what I had done wrong, how I could repair our relationships, what I needed to change about myself to earn back their love and respect. But now I understood that this wasn't about my behavior or my worthiness. This was about greed, about opportunity, about people who had been waiting for Richard to die so they could claim what they felt entitled to without having to share it with the woman who had helped create it. I quietly backed away from the doorway and returned to my bedroom, closing the door with the soft click of someone who had finally stopped fighting a battle she could never win. But I still had something they had forgotten about, something they had overlooked in their systematic inventory of my diminished status in this household. I still had my memory, I still had my clarity, and I still had something deep inside me that refused to disappear just because they wanted me to. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen in absolute silence, in the space between heartbreak and rage, where a person finally stops asking why this is happening and starts asking what they're going to do about it. For me, that transformation began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when I stopped crying and started watching. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no lightning bolt of inspiration, no moment of divine intervention that suddenly filled me with courage and clarity. Instead, it was more like the slow shift of seasons, so gradual that you don't notice it happening, until one day you realize winter has ended and something new is beginning to grow. I had been sitting in the small chair by my bedroom window, the one piece of furniture in the house that Lucas and Miranda seemed to consider too worthless to claim or relocate. From this vantage point, I could see our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, working in her garden, methodically weeding and pruning with the patient persistence of someone who understood that beautiful things required both time and attention to flourish. Mrs. Patterson was 83 years old, a widow like myself, but she carried herself with a dignity and independence that I had somehow lost along the way. She drove her own car, managed her own finances, maintained her own home, and spoke to everyone, including her grown children, with the quiet authority of someone who had never allowed other people to define her worth or control her choices. Watching her through my window, I began to remember who I used to be before grief and manipulation had convinced me I was helpless. I remembered the woman who had managed a household budget for decades, who had negotiated with contractors and dealt with insurance companies, who had raised children and supported a husband, and maintained friendships and participated in community organizations with competence and confidence. That woman hadn't disappeared when Richard died. She had simply been buried under months of systematic psychological abuse, designed to make her believe she was incompetent, unwanted, and entirely dependent on the very people who were destroying her. But she was still there, buried, but not dead, waiting for the right moment to emerge from the rubble of all that had been taken from her. The first thing I did was start paying attention, really paying attention, to the patterns of behavior that had become so normalized I had stopped questioning them. I began to notice the timing of Lucas's financial discussions, how they always happened when I was tired or emotional, when my defenses were down and my ability to think clearly was compromised. I observed the way Miranda would create small crises that required immediate attention, then position herself as the reasonable problem solver while painting me as the source of unnecessary drama. How she would move my belongings to different locations, then express concern about my forgetfulness when I couldn't find them where I had left them. I started keeping track of conversations, writing down dates and exact quotes in a small notebook I kept hidden in my pillowcase. The notebook became my anchor to reality, proof that the gaslighting and manipulation were real rather than products of my supposedly failing memory. February 15th, I wrote. Lucas told me I had already agreed to sign over power of attorney. I have never had this conversation with him. When I said I didn't remember agreeing to this, he said I was becoming confused and that this was exactly why legal arrangements needed to be made. February 18th, I continued. Miranda moved my medications to a different cabinet. When I asked where they were, she said I had moved them myself and suggested I was having episodes of confusion that I couldn't remember. February 22nd, found my checkbook in Miranda's purse. When I asked about it, she said I had given it to her for safekeeping after I had mentioned being worried about making financial mistakes. I have never mentioned any such concern. The notebook filled slowly but steadily with evidence of a systematic campaign to convince me I was losing my mental faculties, while simultaneously taking control of every aspect of my life. Seeing it documented in black and white, with dates and details, made it impossible to dismiss as mere misunderstanding or normal family tension. This wasn't grief. This wasn't concern for my well-being. This was calculated psychological warfare designed to break down my sense of reality until I became completely dependent on people who had already decided I was disposable. But reading my own words, seeing the patterns laid out clearly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anger. Not the helpless, defeated sadness that had been my constant companion since Richard's death, but clean, sharp anger that cut through the fog of depression and self-doubt like a blade. These people had taken advantage of my grief, my vulnerability, my love for them. They had systematically destroyed my confidence, isolated me from my support systems, and stolen my financial resources while I was in the deepest pain of my life. They had turned my own home into a prison and convinced me I should be grateful for the privilege of being their captive. The anger felt good. It felt clean and energizing in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. More importantly, it felt like mine. The first emotion in months that belonged entirely to me, rather than being shaped by their manipulation or filtered through their approval. I began to remember things I had forgotten during the worst period of my depression. I remembered that I had a college degree in business administration, earned when Lucas was small, and I was determined to contribute more than just household labor to our family's success. I remembered managing our family's finances for years while Richard built his career, making decisions about investments and insurance and budgets that had provided security for all of us. I remembered negotiating the purchase of this house, reading every line of the mortgage documents, asking informed questions about interest rates and terms. I remembered setting up college funds for Lucas, researching investment options, monitoring performance over the years to ensure his education would be fully funded. I had not always been helpless. I had not always been dependent. I had been capable, intelligent, resourceful woman who had somehow allowed grief and manipulation to convince her she was none of those things. More importantly, I remembered the lessons my own mother had taught me about the importance of documentation, of keeping records, of being prepared for circumstances when you might need to prove your case to authorities who didn't know your story. A woman alone needs evidence, my mother used to say, speaking from the experience of her own generation when women's rights were even more limited than they were today. Men will take your word when it benefits them, but when it doesn't, you better have paperwork to back up everything you say. My mother had kept meticulous records of everything: medical appointments, financial transactions, property improvements, insurance claims. She had taught me to do the same, but somewhere along the way I had stopped following her advice, trusting Richard to handle the important documentation while I focused on what I considered more immediate concerns. Now I realized that my mother's lessons weren't outdated advice from a more sexist era. They were survival skills that remained relevant whenever someone tried to take advantage of another person's vulnerability. I began my own documentation project with the methodical precision I had once brought to managing our household budget. Every interaction with Lucas and Miranda was recorded with dates, times, witnesses when available, and exact quotes whenever possible. Every financial transaction I could access was photographed or copied. Every medical appointment, every legal document, every piece of mail that arrived in my name was carefully cataloged and stored. The small digital camera Richard had bought me for Christmas 3 years ago became my secret weapon. I photographed the bruises on my arm from the day Lucas had grabbed me, even though they had already faded to yellow-green shadows. I took pictures of my belongings in their original locations, then documented when they were moved without my permission. I photographed the contents of my purse and jewelry box before and after Lucas and Miranda had access to them. Most importantly, I began researching my legal rights as a property owner, as a surviving spouse, as a person who had been systematically abused by family members who had positioned themselves as caregivers. The public library became my classroom, and the computers there provided access to legal resources and support services I hadn't known existed. I learned about elder abuse laws, about financial exploitation, about the legal remedies available to people in my situation. I discovered that many of the things Lucas and Miranda had been doing weren't just cruel. They were actually illegal, violations of statutes designed to protect vulnerable adults from exactly the kind of systematic exploitation I had been experiencing. The knowledge was empowering in ways I hadn't expected. Each new piece of information felt like armor, protection against the psychological manipulation that had been so effective when I didn't understand what was being done to me or why. I also began reaching out to old friends and family members, people I had been told were too busy or not interested in maintaining contact. What I discovered was that many of them had been actively prevented from reaching me, that Lucas and Miranda had been screening my calls and turning away visitors without my knowledge. "Vanessa!" my sister Carol exclaimed when I finally managed to call her from the library. "I've been trying to reach you for months. Every time I called, Lucas said you were sleeping or not feeling well. I was getting so worried. I tried to visit twice," my friend Margaret told me when I ran into her at the grocery store. "Both times, your daughter-in-law answered the door and said you weren't up for company. She said you were having a hard time adjusting to widowhood and needed space to grieve." Space to grieve. As if isolation and abuse were therapeutic. As if cutting me off from everyone who cared about me was somehow in my best interest. The systematic nature of their campaign became even clearer as I realized how many relationships they had sabotaged, how completely they had managed to surround me with their version of reality while blocking access to any outside perspectives that might have helped me understand what was really happening. But now, I was awake. Now, I was watching. Now, I was documenting everything with the patience and precision of someone who understood that justice required evidence, that truth needed proof, that fighting back meant being smarter than the people who had underestimated my capacity for both observation and action. The woman they thought they had broken was stronger than they realized, and she was just getting started. What they had forgotten, in their arrogance and greed, was that grief doesn't make you weak forever. Sometimes it makes you dangerous, especially when it transforms into the kind of focused determination that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. I was no longer the confused, helpless widow they had been manipulating for months. I was a woman with a plan, a woman with evidence, and a woman who had finally remembered that she didn't have to accept their version of who she was supposed to be. It wasn't pain anymore. It was decision. There's a particular kind of power that comes from knowing something your enemies don't realize you know. It's the quiet strength of a chess player who can see 5 moves ahead while their opponent is still focused on the pieces directly in front of them. For the first time in months, I held that advantage, and I was going to use it wisely. My research had revealed that elder protective services existed specifically for situations like mine. The caseworker I spoke with during my carefully planned visit to their downtown office was a woman named Janet Morrison, no relation, despite the shared surname, who had been investigating elder abuse cases for over 15 years. "What you're describing is textbook financial and emotional abuse," Janet told me after I had presented my carefully organized documentation. "The isolation, the gaslighting, the gradual assumption of control over your finances, these are established patterns we see repeatedly in these cases." She examined my photographs, my written records, my bank statements that showed the systematic drainage of accounts I had built over decades of careful saving. Her expression grew more serious with each piece of evidence I presented. "The fact that you've documented everything so thoroughly puts you in a much stronger position than most people in your situation," she continued. "Many victims of elder abuse don't realize what's happening to them until it's too late to prove their case. Your records are excellent. Excellent." After months of being told I was confused, forgetful, and incompetent, hearing a professional describe my work as excellent felt like water in a desert. I hadn't lost my mind or my abilities. I had simply been systematically convinced to doubt both. "What happens next?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the excitement building in my chest. "We'll need to conduct a formal investigation," Janet explained. "That means interviewing all parties involved, examining financial records, and potentially involving law enforcement if we find evidence of criminal activity. Are you prepared for this to become official? Once we start this process, there's no going back to the way things were. No going back." The phrase should have been terrifying, but instead it felt like liberation. I was done pretending that love could survive systematic abuse. Done hoping that patience and forgiveness could transform cruel people into kind ones. Done accepting scraps of basic human dignity in the place where I had once been valued and respected. "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time in months, I meant it completely. Janet scheduled a home visit for the following week, explaining that they would need to see the living conditions and interview all residents of the household. She also provided me with contact information for legal aid services and domestic violence resources that specialized in elder abuse cases. "One more thing," she said as I prepared to leave her office. "Don't change your routine at home. Don't let them know you've been here or that an investigation is beginning. Document any retaliation or escalation in their behavior, but don't provoke confrontations. We need them to continue acting naturally so we can observe their true patterns of behavior." Continue acting naturally. That meant continuing to endure the daily humiliations, the casual cruelties, the systematic erosion of my dignity for just a little longer. But now it wasn't endurance born of helplessness. It was strategic patience with a specific goal in mind. I returned home that afternoon to find Lucas and Miranda in the kitchen, discussing their latest plan to help me manage my declining capabilities. They had contacted a residential care facility and were planning to schedule a tour, ostensibly so I could see my options for assisted living. "We're just being proactive," Miranda explained with the patronizing tone she used when presenting their control as concern. "It's better to make these decisions while you're still capable of participating in the process, rather than waiting until you have no choice." While you're still capable. The implication was clear. My capacity for decision-making was temporary and diminishing, and they were the responsible parties who needed to step in before I became completely incompetent. The assisted living facility wasn't being presented as one option among many. It was being framed as an inevitable necessity that I should accept gratefully while I still had the mental ability to understand why it was in my best interest. "The place we found has excellent reviews," Lucas added, spreading brochures across the kitchen table. "Beautiful grounds, professional staff, lots of activities for the residents. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, medical supervision. It would take so much pressure off everyone. So much pressure off everyone. Not off me. Everyone. As if my presence in my own home was a burden that needed to be relieved rather than a right that needed to be respected. As if moving me to an institution would solve their problems rather than addressing my needs." I looked at the brochures with their glossy photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in craft projects and group exercises. The facilities looked pleasant enough, but the subtext was unmistakable. These were places where people went when their families no longer wanted to deal with them, when they had become inconvenient reminders of mortality and responsibility. "It looks very nice," I said quietly, keeping my voice neutral while internally cataloging this conversation for my next report to Janet Morrison. "When were you thinking about scheduling this tour?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Miranda replied with the satisfaction of someone who had already made all the arrangements without consulting the person most affected by the decision. "I've already spoken with the admissions coordinator. They have availability, and the sooner we move on this, the better. The sooner we move on this. Not the sooner I could make an informed decision about my future, but the sooner they could transfer responsibility for my care to paid professionals while maintaining control over the assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating." "I think that's very thoughtful of you both," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth but serving their purpose of maintaining the facade of cooperation that would keep them from suspecting anything had changed. That evening, I transcribed every detail of our conversation into my documentation, noting the pressure tactics, the presumption of decision-making authority, and the timeline they had established for moving me out of my own home. Each word I wrote felt like another nail in the coffin of their credibility. The facility tour took place as scheduled, with Lucas and Miranda providing commentary that was clearly designed to sell me on the benefits of institutional living while downplaying any concerns I might have about losing my independence. "Look at this beautiful common area," Miranda said as we walked through a space filled with elderly residents watching television or playing card games. "You'd have so much social interaction here. No more sitting alone in the house all day." Sitting alone in the house all day, as if my isolation wasn't something they had deliberately created by blocking my contact with friends and family, as if my loneliness was a personal failing rather than the result of their systematic campaign to cut me off from everyone who cared about me. "And the medical supervision is excellent," Lucas added, gesturing toward a nurse's station where uniformed staff monitored residents' medication schedules and vital signs. "You wouldn't have to worry about managing your prescriptions or remembering appointments. Everything would be handled for you. Everything would be handled for you." The phrase was meant to sound reassuring, but I heard it as the final step in their plan to render me completely powerless. In this facility, I wouldn't just lose control over my finances and my daily routine. I would lose autonomy over my own body, my medical decisions, my basic right to move freely through the world. The room they showed me was clean and adequately furnished, with a single bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The walls were painted institutional beige, and the only personal touches were a few framed photographs of people I didn't recognize, former residents whose families had apparently left these images behind when they moved on to other arrangements. "It's lovely," I said, maintaining the performance of grateful compliance while photographing everything with my phone when they weren't looking. "How much does a place like this cost?" The question seemed to catch them off guard, as if they hadn't expected me to ask about practical details. The admissions coordinator, a cheerful woman in her 40s who had clearly given this tour many times before, quoted a monthly fee that would consume nearly all of my Social Security and pension income. "But of course the family usually helps with the additional costs," she said, glancing at Lucas and Miranda with the assumption that they would naturally want to contribute to my care. "Room and board is just the base fee. There are additional charges for medications, medical appointments, special dietary needs, activities, and personal care services. Additional charges. I could see Lucas calculating numbers in his head, trying to determine how much of my income would be consumed by basic survival, and how much would be left over for the family to manage. The facility wasn't just a solution to their problem of having to live with me, it was a way to maintain legal access to my financial resources while transferring all responsibility for my actual care to paid professionals. "We'll definitely need to go over the financial arrangements carefully," Lucas said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was already planning to be very involved in those arrangements. "Make sure everything is set up properly." Set up properly. I knew exactly what that meant. Set up so that he maintained control over my finances while I was warehoused in an institutional setting where my complaints about financial abuse would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman who was no longer competent to manage her own affairs. We drove home in silence, but I could feel the satisfaction radiating from Lucas and Miranda like heat from a fire. They thought they had solved their problem, found the perfect way to dispose of me while maintaining access to everything I had worked my entire life to build. They had no idea that their solution was about to become evidence in a criminal investigation. That night, I called Janet Morrison from the library and provided her with a detailed account of the day's events, including the timeline they had established for moving me out of the house and the financial arrangements they were planning to make on my behalf. "This is accelerating faster than I expected," Janet said, her voice carrying a note of urgency I hadn't heard before. "I'm going to move up our home visit to this Friday. Can you make sure you're there when we arrive?" "I'll be there," I promised, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness about the confrontation that was finally approaching. Friday was 3 days away. 3 more days of pretending to be the helpless, grateful mother who was accepting their guidance with appreciation rather than documenting their crimes with precision. 3 more days of watching them plan my disposal, while they remained blissfully unaware that I had already set in motion the process that would expose exactly who they really were. I spent those 3 days in a state of heightened awareness, noting every detail, every conversation, every casual cruelty that revealed their true character. They had gotten so comfortable with their power over me that they no longer bothered to hide their contempt or their excitement about finally getting rid of the inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. But their comfort was about to become their downfall, and their certainty was about to become their conviction. The calm before the storm was almost over, and I was ready for the lightning to strike. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that seemed to promise significant events. I woke up before dawn, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. The feeling of someone who had been planning a surprise party and was finally going to see the guests' reactions when they walked through the door. Lucas and Miranda were in particularly good spirits at breakfast, discussing their weekend plans with the casual cheerfulness of people who believed their problems were about to be permanently solved. They had scheduled the assisted living facility paperwork for Monday morning, and Miranda was already talking about how they would redecorate my bedroom once it became available. "I'm thinking we could turn it into a home office," she said, spreading cream cheese on her bagel with obvious satisfaction. "Lucas really needs a proper workspace, and that room gets such beautiful morning light." My bedroom, the room I had shared with Richard for 35 years, where I had recovered from childbirth and illness, where I had held my husband's hand during his final days, was already being mentally converted into Miranda's vision of improved functionality. They weren't even waiting for me to leave before planning how to erase every trace of my existence from the space. "The whole house will feel different," Lucas agreed, sipping his coffee with the contentment of someone whose burdens were about to be lifted. "More like ours, you know. We can finally make the changes we've been talking about. More like ours." As if the house had never really been mine. As if my decades of residence had been a temporary arrangement that was finally coming to its natural conclusion. They spoke about my displacement with the same tone they might use to discuss removing outdated furniture or replacing an aging appliance. I nodded and smiled, playing my role perfectly while internally noting every word for the final entry in my documentation. "That sounds wonderful, dear," I said, my voice carrying just the right note of grateful compliance. "I'm sure you'll make it beautiful." At exactly 2 p.m., The doorbell rang with the crisp, official sound that announced the arrival of people who carried authority rather than mere social courtesy. I could see through the living room window that there were 2 cars in our driveway, one marked with the county seal, the other an unmarked sedan that suggested law enforcement involvement. "Who could that be?" Miranda asked, her voice carrying the first note of uncertainty I had heard from her in months. She moved to the window, and I watched her expression change as she took in the official nature of our visitors. "Vanessa Morrison?" The woman at the door was Janet Morrison, looking professional and official in her county-issued jacket. Behind her stood a police officer and another woman I didn't recognize but who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Yes, that's me," I replied, opening the door wider with the calm demeanor of someone who had been expecting this visit. "Please, come in." Lucas appeared behind me, his face already showing the confusion of someone whose carefully controlled environment was suddenly subject to outside interference. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man who was accustomed to being in charge, but was beginning to sense that his authority was being challenged. "I'm Janet Morrison with Elder Protective Services," Janet said, producing her credentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "This is Officer Stevens with the county police, and this is Sarah Chen from the district attorney's office. We're here to conduct a wellness check and investigate reports of possible elder abuse." Elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped into the center of their perfect plan. I watched Lucas's face go through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like panic as he began to understand the implications of what was happening. "There must be some mistake," Miranda said, her voice jumping to that higher pitch that people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while their world is collapsing around them. "Mrs. Morrison is our responsibility. We take excellent care of her. Who would have reported something like that?" "I did," I said quietly, stepping forward with the calm dignity of someone who had finally decided to tell the truth. "I reported it." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas stared at me as if I had suddenly transformed into someone he didn't recognize, which was ironically accurate. I was no longer the broken, helpless woman they had been manipulating for months. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a note of betrayal that might have been heartbreaking if it had come from someone who actually loved me, rather than someone who was upset about losing control over his victim. "What are you talking about? We've been taking care of you. We've been trying to help you." "Help me," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "Is that what you call taking my money without permission? Isolating me from my friends and family? Physically grabbing me and telling me I don't belong in my own home?" Officer Stevens stepped forward, his hand moving automatically to his notebook. "Ma'am, are you saying you've been physically assaulted?" I rolled up my sleeve, revealing the faded but still visible bruises on my arm from the day Lucas had yanked me out of Richard's chair. "These are from when my son grabbed me for sitting in my late husband's chair. I have photographs of the bruises when they were fresh." Lucas's face went pale. That was an accident. I was upset about Dad, and it wasn't intentional." "Nah, the photographs suggest otherwise," Sarah Chen said, consulting a folder that I realized contained copies of all my documentation. "We also have extensive records of financial irregularities, unauthorized account access, and systematic isolation tactics that follow established patterns of elder abuse." "Financial irregularities?" Miranda's voice had risen to a near shriek. "We've been managing her finances because she asked us to. She was confused after her husband died, making mistakes." "According to bank records," Sarah Chen interrupted, "over $40,000 has been transferred from Mrs. Morrison's accounts to accounts controlled by you and your husband without proper documentation or legal authorization. That constitutes financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. $40,000. Hearing the actual number spoken aloud in front of witnesses made the theft real in a way that my private documentation couldn't. This wasn't a family disagreement about money management. This was criminal behavior with specific dollar amounts and legal consequences. "She gave us permission," Lucas protested, but his voice carried the desperation of someone who knew his explanations weren't going to be sufficient. "She wanted us to handle things for her." "Do you have documentation of this permission?" Officer Stevens asked. "Power of attorney documents? Written authorization? Anything that would legally justify taking control of another adult's financial resources? The silence stretched uncomfortably as Lucas and Miranda realized they had no legal justification for their actions. All their careful manipulation had been based on psychological control rather than legal authority, and now they were facing people who understood the difference. "We need to speak with Mrs. Morrison privately," Janet said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be argued with. "Officer Stevens will remain here with you while we conduct our interview." They led me to the kitchen, my kitchen, where I had prepared thousands of meals for this family, and closed the door behind us. For the first time in months, I was in my own home with people who were there to protect me rather than control me. "How are you holding up?" Janet asked, her professional demeanor softening slightly now that we were away from the people who had been abusing me. "I'm tired," I admitted, feeling the weight of months of fear and pretense finally lifting from my shoulders. But I'm also relieved. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. "Your documentation is some of the most thorough I've ever seen in these cases," Sarah Chen said. "Dates, times, photographs, financial records. You've built an airtight case. Most victims of elder abuse don't have nearly this level of evidence." Through the kitchen door, I could hear Lucas and Miranda talking in urgent, hushed tones with Officer Stevens. Their voices carried the panic of people who had suddenly realized that their victims weren't as powerless as they had assumed, that actions have consequences even when you think no one is watching. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew from my research what the likely outcomes would be. "Criminal charges for financial exploitation and elder abuse," Sarah Chen explained. "Restitution for the stolen funds, restraining orders if necessary, and most importantly, you get to decide what happens to your own life and your own property. Your own life and your own property." After months of being told I was incompetent, confused, and dependent, hearing a prosecutor acknowledge my right to self-determination felt like stepping out of a dark cave into brilliant sunlight. "There's one more thing," I said, reaching into my purse for the document I had prepared earlier in the week. "I want to file for a protective order. I don't want them in this house anymore." I had researched the process thoroughly, filled out all the necessary paperwork, and gathered all the required evidence. The protective order would legally require Lucas and Miranda to stay away from me and my property while the criminal case proceeded through the courts. "Are you sure about this?" Janet asked gently. "This will mean they have to leave immediately. Today. They won't be able to return even to collect their belongings without police supervision." I thought about Richard's chair, sitting empty in the living room where I hadn't been allowed to sit in peace. I thought about the bedroom where Miranda was already planning her home office improvements. I thought about the kitchen where she had dismissed my attempts to care for my family as unwanted interference. Most of all, I thought about the woman I used to be before they convinced me I was helpless, and the woman I was becoming now that I remembered my own strength. "I'm sure," I said, my voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had finally stopped accepting unacceptable treatment. "This is my home, and I want them out of it." When we returned to the living room, Lucas and Miranda were sitting on the couch they had been planning to replace, their faces showing the stunned expression of people whose carefully constructed reality had just collapsed around them. "Lucas Morrison and Miranda Morrison," Officer Stevens said, reading from an official document. "You are hereby served with a temporary protective order requiring you to vacate these premises immediately and maintain no contact with Vanessa Morrison pending criminal proceedings." "You can't be serious," Miranda said, her voice finally losing all pretense of sweetness and revealing the ugly anger that had always lurked beneath her fake concern. "This is ridiculous. We live here. We take care of her." "You have 30 minutes to pack essential belongings," Officer Stevens continued, ignoring her protests. "You will be escorted from the property and may not return without court permission and police supervision." I watched them scramble through the house, grabbing clothes and personal items with the frantic energy of people who couldn't quite believe what was happening to them. Lucas kept looking at me as if he expected me to suddenly remember that I was supposed to be helpless and dependent, as if his mother would surely rescue him from the consequences of his own actions. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was the woman who had documented their crimes, who had researched my rights, who had reached out for help when help was needed. I was the woman who had remembered that love doesn't require accepting abuse, and that family relationships don't justify criminal behavior. As they loaded their hastily packed belongings into their car, Miranda turned back toward the house with one final attempt to re-establish control. "You'll never be able to manage without us," she shouted, her mask of concern finally slipping completely to reveal the contempt that had always been there. "You're a confused old woman who can't even take care of herself." I stood in the doorway of my own home, surrounded by the officials who had taken my complaints seriously and acted on my evidence, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete, unshakable certainty about who I was and what I deserved. "Watch me," I said quietly, and closed the door. 6 months later, I sat in Richard's chair, my chair, watching the sunrise paint our garden in shades of gold and pink, holding a cup of coffee that I had brewed in my own kitchen, in my own time, without anyone's permission or approval. The simple pleasure of beginning my day in peace, surrounded by beauty I had chosen, and silence I controlled, still felt like a miracle worth savoring. The legal proceedings had moved forward with the methodical precision that characterizes justice when it's supported by thorough documentation and clear evidence. Lucas and Miranda had initially hired expensive lawyers and mounted a defense based on claims that they had been acting in my best interest, that I was mentally incompetent, and had requested their assistance with financial management. But my documentation proved otherwise. The photographs, the recorded conversations, the detailed timeline of their systematic abuse, and, most importantly, the medical and psychological evaluations that confirmed my complete mental competency. All of it combined to create a case so compelling that their lawyers eventually advised them to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a trial that would only result in harsher sentences. Lucas was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation and ordered to pay full restitution of the $43,000 he had stolen from my accounts. The court also required him to complete counseling for domestic violence perpetrators and to perform 200 hours of community service with elderly care organizations, a touch of poetic justice that I found particularly satisfying. Miranda received 18 months of probation and was banned from any employment or volunteer work involving vulnerable adults. She was also required to attend financial ethics counseling and to contribute to a victim compensation fund that supported other survivors of elder abuse. But beyond the legal consequences, they faced something that might have been even more devastating to people who valued reputation and social standing above human decency: public exposure. The local newspaper covered the case extensively, and the story of their systematic abuse of a grieving widow spread through our community like wildfire. The same neighbors and friends who had been told I was declining and difficult now understood exactly what had been happening behind our closed doors. The church congregation that had been informed I was too unwell for visitors learned that I had actually been isolated and manipulated by family members who had positioned themselves as caregivers while systematically destroying my independence. Lucas lost his job at the financial services firm, where reputation and trustworthiness were essential qualifications. Miranda found herself ostracized from the social circles where she had previously enjoyed status as a devoted daughter-in-law, caring for her elderly mother-in-law. The narrative they had constructed about themselves collapsed under the weight of documented truth. I felt no satisfaction in their social destruction, only relief that other potential victims might be protected from similar treatment by people who had revealed their true character so completely. More importantly, I had my life back. My real life, not the diminished existence they had tried to convince me was all I deserved. The house felt different now, larger, brighter, filled with the possibility of new memories rather than haunted by recent trauma. I had the locks changed immediately after they left, a symbolic gesture that felt as important as the practical security it provided. Every door that opened now opened for people I had chosen to welcome, not for people who had decided they owned access to my space. My first act of reclaiming my independence was redecorating the bedroom Miranda had been so eager to convert into her home office. I painted the walls a warm yellow that reminded me of spring mornings, arranged photographs of Richard and our happier times in beautiful new frames, and bought fresh bedding that felt like a cocoon of comfort and safety. But the most important change was internal. I had rediscovered the woman I used to be: competent, intelligent, capable of managing my own affairs and making my own decisions. The months of psychological manipulation had temporarily obscured her, but they hadn't destroyed her, and she had emerged stronger for having survived the test. My friend Margaret, who had tried so many times to visit during my captivity, became a regular companion for grocery shopping, church attendance, and social activities I had been denied for so long. My sister Carol drove down from Sacramento every few weeks, and our phone conversations were no longer monitored or restricted. "You sound like yourself again," Carol told me during one of her visits. "For months, whenever I managed to talk to you, you sounded so small and uncertain. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help." The church congregation welcomed me back with the warmth of people who had genuinely missed my presence rather than simply tolerated it. I resumed my volunteer work with the food pantry, and within months I was coordinating meal deliveries to homebound members. Ironic work for someone who had been told she was too confused to manage her own daily living. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor whose independence had inspired my own awakening, became a dear friend and unofficial mentor in the art of aging with dignity and strength. She taught me that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely, that solitude could be peaceful rather than isolating when it was chosen rather than imposed. "The secret," she told me over tea in her immaculate garden, "is remembering that you've survived everything life has thrown at you so far. That's not accident. That's evidence of your strength." I began painting again, something I had abandoned years earlier when the demands of caring for others had consumed all my creative energy. The art supplies felt foreign in my hands at first, but muscle memory returned gradually, and soon I was creating landscapes and still lifes that captured the beauty I saw in my reclaimed world. The paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, expressions of my vision, my emotions, my way of seeing the world around me. I hung them throughout the house, replacing the neutral prints that had decorated our walls for years with images that reflected my own artistic voice. One painting in particular held special meaning, a watercolor of Richard's chair sitting in a pool of morning sunlight, surrounded by the flowers he had loved. It wasn't a memorial to loss, but a celebration of love that endured beyond death, of memories that belonged to me regardless of who else might try to claim or control them. The financial restitution, when it finally arrived, felt less important than the principle it represented. The money had never been about the dollars themselves. It had been about respect, about acknowledging that my resources were mine to control, about recognizing that taking from vulnerable people was theft, regardless of family relationships or claimed good intentions. I used some of the restored funds to improve the house in ways that reflected my own preferences, rather than someone else's vision of what I should want. New carpeting in colors I loved, kitchen appliances that made cooking a pleasure again, a security system that made me feel safe and independent. But the most meaningful expense was hiring a lawyer to update my will and establish ironclad legal protections against any future attempts to exploit my vulnerability. No one would ever again be able to claim authority over my finances, my medical decisions, or my living arrangements without clear, documented consent that I could revoke at any time. The lawyer, an elderly woman named Ruth Alexander who specialized in elder rights, became both a legal advisor and a personal inspiration. "You've done something remarkable," she told me after reviewing my case files. "Most people in your situation never fight back. They accept the abuse because they've been convinced they deserve it or because they don't believe anyone will take them seriously." "I almost didn't fight back," I admitted. "There were days when I believed what they were telling me about myself. But you didn't stay in that place," Ruth reminded me. "You documented everything, you reached out for help, and you followed through when help arrived. That takes tremendous courage." Courage. I had never thought of myself as particularly brave, but surviving systematic abuse and emerging with my dignity intact required a kind of strength I hadn't known I possessed. Today, as I sit in my garden watching the roses Richard and I planted decades ago bloom in their third season since his death, I think about the lessons this experience has taught me. Love doesn't require accepting cruelty. Family relationships don't justify criminal behavior. Growing older doesn't mean becoming powerless. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to remember who you really are, to stand up for your own worth, to demand the respect and dignity that every human being deserves regardless of their age, their circumstances, or their vulnerability. The woman who was yanked out of this chair 8 months ago felt helpless and alone. The woman sitting here now knows she is neither. I have rebuilt my life not around the people who claim to love me while destroying me, but around those who demonstrate love through respect, support, and genuine care for my well-being. Lucas sends letters occasionally, awkward attempts at reconciliation that focus more on his own suffering than on acknowledgement of what he did to me. I read them and file them away, responses to a relationship that died when he chose greed over love, control over compassion. I don't hate him. Hatred would give him power over my emotions that I'm no longer willing to surrender. Instead, I feel the calm detachment that comes from understanding exactly who someone is and choosing to protect yourself accordingly. Miranda has made no attempt at contact, which suits me perfectly. Some people reveal their true character under pressure, and once revealed, that knowledge becomes a permanent protection against future manipulation. I am 70 years old, widowed, living alone in a house that sometimes feels too large, but never feels lonely. I manage my own finances, make my own medical decisions, choose my own friends, and plan my own future with the confidence of someone who has been tested and proven her own strength. When people ask how I survived what happened to me, I tell them it wasn't survival, it was awakening. I didn't just endure abuse, I discovered reserves of power I didn't know I possessed. I didn't just escape exploitation. I reclaimed my identity as a woman worthy of respect and capable of protecting herself. The chair beside me will always be Richard's chair, the place where he read his newspapers and shared his thoughts and showed me what real love looked like. But this chair, the one where I was told I didn't belong, this chair is mine. I claimed it, I fought for it, and I will never let anyone take it from me again. Some might say this story is about justice, but I know it's really about something more fundamental. It's about remembering that no matter how dark things become, no matter how powerless others try to make you feel, you always have choices. You can document the truth. You can reach out for help. You can fight back. And sometimes, if you're very brave and very persistent and very lucky, you can win. I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life. And once you've done it, no one can ever take it away from you again. The sunrise is complete now. The garden fully illuminated, the coffee gone cold while I've been lost in memories and gratitude. It's time to start my day, planned according to my preferences, filled with activities I choose, surrounded by people who value rather than exploit me. At 70 years old, I'm finally living the life I was always meant to live, free, dignified, and absolutely, unshakably mine.